We're gonna just look at some of those, I think, some of those, claims. Explicit claims, yeah, 196. Okay, so just skip down to the end of 197 under Messiah, right? Or Christos or Christ, depending on if you're using the Greek or the anglicization of the Greek. And we're going to read Peter's famous confession right at the bottom of 197, going over to 198. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." That's from Mark 8, 27 to 30. And John the Baptist, he asked a question. He asked, "Who is Jesus?" And he gets an answer. Peter also in John 6:69 says about Jesus, "We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God," which is the Messiah. And no, it's not in here, but we're going to look it up. Matthew 11. This is or John the Baptist. Is this, let me see, I had to write some extra notes here. Actually, I think I'm going to look it up in Luke chapter 7. And I brought an extra, should have brought more. I brought one extra Bible. You know how odd that we come to. Should have brought more, I guess.
Luke what?
Luke 7.
7.
And 18 through 23. Now, see, in the study guide, they gave us a lot of scriptures I supplemented. Let's see if I can get this to work. Riku, if I can get my phone to work, I'll. That's just spinning in circles, of course.
Metric service.
No, there's not. John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling 2 of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? In other words, are you the Messiah, or should we wait for the real guy to come along?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you to ask, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" At that very time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, and evil spirits, and gave sight to many who were blind. So he replied to the messengers, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." And that comes right out of Isaiah 35. verses 5 and 6. Then will the eyes of the blinded be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. And then it also comes out of Isaiah 61 as well, thrown in there. But of course, Isaiah 35 is about what will happen when the Messiah comes. And so Jesus is saying, hey, you're seeing the work of the Messiah. Go back and tell John the Baptist what you're seeing. So yeah, Jesus definitely, I think, thought he was the Messiah, the one who's to come. The story of the triumphal entry, which of course we just celebrated, 3 weeks ago? Yeah, just before, where Jesus rides into Jerusalem, fulfilling the prophecy from Zechariah 9:9. And also interesting too is the cleansing of the temple, which took place either depending on right around the triumphal entry, and that actually fulfilled Zechariah 14:21. And there shall no longer be traitors in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. So Jesus was also fulfilling that one from Zechariah. I think this is probably, because, well, let's see, that one ties them all together if we go there. Because Jesus also, not only did he claim to be the Messiah, he claimed to be the Son of God and the Son of Man. And that's an important distinction, the Son of Man, not a Son of Man, as we've read in here. Because if you've read Ezekiel, he calls himself a Son of Man, which is, it's showing his humility. But Jesus, by calling himself the Son of Man, is showing his link to prophecy and that he is the Messiah. And we're going to spend a little time looking at that one because of the connection to Daniel. And there's some interesting things there about the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7, which we'll look at. But you think about what Jesus said in Matthew 11:27 or Luke 10:22, all things have been handed over to me by the Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him to. So that's talking about his relationship with the Father under Son of God. And the parables he told. You think about the parable of the vineyard. Right? In Mark 12:1-9, where Israel is seen as the vineyard and the Jewish religious leaders are the renters, and the owner sends his servant to collect his share, and he gets beat up. So he sends another servant, a little higher ranking servant, they beat him up, and then so finally he sends his only son. And they decide, well, the best thing to do is kill the son and take the vineyard for ourselves. They kill the son. Of course, it doesn't work out quite so well for them. They don't get the vineyard. And the thing is the religious leaders knew instantly, if you go back and you look at the end of that, they knew that Jesus was saying this against them. And that Jesus was saying that he was the Son. If you look, the religious leaders were actually pretty smart guys because they picked up on a lot of the parables when the disciples didn't, especially when they were seen in a negative light in the parable. And then Son of Man, and this one is, like, there's only one use outside of the Gospels of this in Acts 7:56. So we know that it wasn't added to the Gospels later, because it was just not a title that Christianity used. It was a title that Jesus used for himself. And he is the Son of Man. So we'll look at Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Start in verse 9. Yes. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head as white as like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beast had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Let's go to Mark 14. You can keep your finger in Daniel 7 though, before you turn away. Keep your finger in Daniel 7 because we'll come back to that. Mark 14, and we're going to start in verse, let's see, 60, I think.
60?
Yes. Mark 14, starting in verse 60. And on page, I thought it was too thin. Page 209, there's part of it. 60 through 64 is on 209. Yeah, 209 has 60 through 64, right towards the top. See it indented a little more. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. Okay, so obviously Jesus thinks he's the Messiah. He's stated it plainly here. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Right back to Daniel 7 where we read, 600 or so years before Jesus. The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked them. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. So Jesus he explicitly claims here to be the Messiah and the Son of Man. The religious leaders completely understood what he was saying. And you'll notice it goes beyond merely just claiming to be the Messiah, because that is not what blasphemy was to the Jewish religious leaders. What blasphemy was saying that you were God. And so they completely understood by what Jesus said here about being the Son of Man and coming in the clouds. Jesus is going beyond just saying I'm the Messiah. He's saying I'm God. And that's why they said, oh, this is blasphemy, because you're saying you are God. And what's interesting, if we go back to Daniel 7, it's too bad Larry wasn't here, because it's a good one to use with Jehovah's Witnesses. Because if we look at, verse 9, the Ancient of Days took his seat. Verse 13, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Now that's key there, because who is coming?
Jesus.
Right? The Son of Man, he's the one who's coming. Go over to verse 22. And verse 22 says, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. So who's coming? The one like the Son of Man. And who comes? Who shows up? The Ancient of Days. It is Daniel and the Jewish leaders, I think, because they understood their Old Testament well, they realized when you claim to be the Son of Man who is coming in the clouds of glory, you are actually saying that you are the Ancient of Days. Because it's the Son of Man who comes, and it's the Ancient of Days who shows up. Which I find very interesting. And actually, if you think about that, that goes beyond a lot of these claims. Oh, did Jesus think he was the Messiah? Well, not only did Jesus think he was the Messiah, Jesus here is saying he is the Ancient of Days. He is God. That's to me, that's pretty explicit. That's there's nothing implicit about that. I told Bob we'd end early tonight. Anybody have any questions or anyone that they want to look at or talk about?
When he was, Strobel was talking about the trillions and trillions of coffee, Jesus did it, and he's the only one in history that's done it, and it was so much against that anybody could have even possibly been able to do it that wasn't the Son of God. Why did the Jews not look at that?
Well,
They just blind, just totally blind.
They are. You think about what Paul says. That when even non-Jews, but when the Old Testament is read, there is a veil that covers. They don't understand, and I mean the reality is none of us understand unless the Holy Spirit brings sight. That's the only reason that we're saved. That's the only reason that we realize who Jesus is, because without that, the veil covers, and we're blind to the reality. Even though, right, so they said that was based on Jesus fulfilling 48 prophecies, which is far less than he actually fulfilled. And then, I forget, what was that, like 1 to
A lot of
trillion.
Right.
I mean, and that was for 48. The odds are staggering.
They can't the Jewish people can't logically sit down and look at that and see any
Well,
of that?
logic alone is not enough. I mean, I think they can, but I mean, they also have counter missionary movements, right, to try and counter some of these ideas.
Okay.
But like the one scholar said, I don't remember his name, who is Jewish, right? He read the Hebrew and then he read the English from Isaiah. When his friend just typed up that section of Isaiah and took it around, even the Jews where he worked said, well, this is Jesus. And that's one of the things, is you sort of remove it from here, because we have these preconceived ideas about the Bible. But by removing it from that, just presenting it on a regular piece of paper without verses and without names of books and chapters, it takes away some of those preconceived ideas, and which helps. It helps remove the veil, because our society, our friends, our culture, our religion, we're affected by it whether we want to believe it or not. I think there's another one where that guy actually talks about how he became saved, and it was through a lady who just said, okay, start reading these prophecies out of the Old Testament, and eventually came to the realization that there was no way he could deny that this was talking about Jesus. And if you remember back earlier in this chapter, it said one of the things we need to do is not think about this as we examine these, like the four Gospels, as one book, one writing, but we need to think about them as individual books that have been collected and put together, which is what all of these are. That's why they all have Genesis, Exodus. That's why they all have different names, is because they're individual books that have been collected together and put together. And then that's one of the things to see how truthful they are, right? When Mark says it and Luke says it, or Mark says it and Matthew says it, well, that gives some proof that, yeah, this, especially if you're looking at this in a scholarly way, that this probably really did happen, because you have two different sources, not one source, but you have Matthew and you have Mark, or you have Matthew and you have Luke, two different sources.
And there are different times.
Yeah, they were written, different authors, written at different times. And you think about Luke, well, Luke was like the historian. Or I kind of think of Luke as like the old investigative reporter, right? Well, he heard these stories, and so Theophilus must have heard these stories, so he sent Luke off. Hey, Luke, I'll pay you to go check this stuff out. You write back to me and let me know if it's true or not. And so Luke went and he did his investigative reporting. In the chapter they say, well, you can see that Luke probably interviewed a lot of women, and that's where a lot of his extra material came from, was from the women. And if you think about it, Luke's resurrection account is all about the women. Mm-hmm. And he lists 3 or 4 by name, and those are probably 3 or 4 of his sources, because those women had bankrolled, basically, they bankrolled Jesus in his earthly ministry. And so he's checking them out. I think, I didn't mention it on Sunday when I talked about Cleopas and his companions. Cleopas was probably one of those people that Luke interviewed, and that's why he's listed by name in there, so that when you're reading Luke at that time, you can say, oh, Cleopas, oh yeah, I know that guy. I can go ask him if this really happened. Simon of Cyrene, who was pulled out of the crowd to carry the cross for Jesus. What does it say? Whose sons were, I forget their names right now, one starts with an R. I want to say Raphael, but I know that's not true. Rufus, Rufus and I think it might be Alexander, his two sons. And so what, and I think that was in Mark that he said that. And what they're doing is they're saying, you can go to these people and ask them if what I have written is the truth.
Got you.
So, I mean, these little things are included for a reason, because they're biographies, ancient biographies, first century biographies, and the people were still alive, so they're saying, hey, you want to know if this guy carried the cross? Go ask his two sons, because they seen him carry the cross. Right? You want to know if the tomb was empty? Go ask these ladies, because they found that the tomb was empty.
I never heard it explained like that. That kind of makes the Bible.
It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It adds to the historical weight of what's going on. And I mean, when you start to read Acts, you realize how good of a historian Luke was. I mean, he starts off his gospel with some incredible Greek, highly educated, just like the great Greek philosophers and historians of his time, right? But then he goes into Greek of the common man when he writes the gospel. But he's showing you in his opening how highly educated he is, and that if he wanted to, he could write on the same level as the great Greek and Roman philosophers and historians. But the purpose of the Bible isn't to communicate with just the upper classes, it's to communicate with all the classes. But in Acts, and then there's a shift, and they talk about it in Acts, where all of a sudden Luke is going from Paul and Barnabas and Paul and Silas, and to all of a sudden it's a we, because all of a sudden Luke is joined in Paul. He's been picked up. He's on the boat, or hanging out.
You already know it all.
Yeah, he's hanging out in prison, so now he's joined. But I mean, the detail that he talks about, right? When he talks about, when not to sail in the Mediterranean. Well, I mean, there's still a lot of truth to that, because the storms still come at the same time, and we were anchored here on the leeward side of Crete, and all. I mean, it's incredible, because he was there, and he was a historian, and he wrote it.
Well, he had to do the same thing when to find out what happened to Jesus when he was hauled away basically to prison in that time period. What did they do to him, who did it, and where was he at? And I think the Sadducees and Pharisees, the reason they didn't want to listen to him is because they knew that if they said he was who he was, they were out of business. Their whole rapture of what they thought and what they taught, and they knew the Old Testament, they knew it word for word, and they just didn't want to honor it because they didn't want a guy that just came and walked around the cities and did these fabulous things. They wanted a guy that got up there and just beat the living tar out of the Romans, destroyed them, got rid of them. Of course, then they buttered up to the Romans as soon as they saw they couldn't get away with that.
See, I can understand them in Jesus' time not believing, just for the reasons you stated. They didn't want to lose their power. But it just would seem to me like anybody that read the Old Testament today and looked at it as a historical document, and then Jewish people, they don't believe the New Testament at all, right? So they don't even, so maybe that's why they don't line things up, because they don't even look at it.
No, yeah, there's ends.
Okay.
Their books are in a little different order too in the Old Testament, but theirs ends before Matthew begins.
Right.
Well, and they've got some other books too that were written
that
they use.
They have some, but they don't. They have like a commentary or stuff like the Talmud there that they were talking about. Yeah. But I mean, when you sit down and you start to look, it's hard to not see. There's some,
I used to think that the Old Testament was not for us at all. I just thought, oh, that's a Jewish thing, and the New Testament was ours. And then you start having those references to Jesus pointed out, and you're like, oh, wow. I mean, how could they have written something 600, 800 years before it happened, and then have it happen exactly the way they said? Again, it just doesn't happen.
well, like they pointed out in the video, right? David writing Psalm 22. They pierced my hands and my feet.
Before there was even crucifixion,
Yeah,
right?
nearly 1,000 years before the Romans invented crucifixion. And I mean, there's a lot more in that psalm too. If you start, right? It talks about the people who gathered around the cross and mocked him, and how they gambled for his clothes. And I mean, okay, so if you take the approach, okay, that Jesus set this all up, how did he set up the Romans gambling for his clothes
From the cross.
while he was hanging on the cross dying?
Yeah. And how did he set
I
up?
mean, either it wasn't a setup and it was a fulfillment of prophecy, or Jesus actually has a lot more miraculous powers than people give him credit for, because somehow he was able to control these Romans while he's hanging on the cross and get him to do what he wanted.
Well, and the fact that they didn't break any of his bones when they did to the others,
Right.
to speed up their death.
The
But
two on the other side, the two thieves, yes. But Scripture says that none of his bones will be broken, and they weren't.
Now, what was your question about the women and there at the cross?
Well, we were talking about Luke and how he probably used a lot of the women for.
No, yeah, I know,
Yeah.
just now you mentioned that.
We were talking about what was going on at the cross in relation to Psalm 22. The soldiers gambling for the clothes, the group of people there mocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But it seemed to be, anyway, my impression was how he communicated under the circumstances with the women.
So actually what we were saying was,
Okay, I misunderstood.
yeah. So we were talking about how either Jesus fulfilled these prophecies,
Yeah.
or somehow he was able to manipulate the Romans into gambling for his clothes. Yeah, if in case you don't believe.
Yeah, but God had no problem.
And that, I think, pretty well sums it up right there.
God had no problem.
Yeah.
He'd have to be a miracle worker.
He'd have to be a miracle worker.
That's good. Good one, Mark.
Yeah, and I mean, there it is. There, what more needs said right there.